The Dark Scrolls. Under the dim light of history's oldest vaults, there lies a life recorded in fragments. Parchment stained by time, ink faded by centuries, and yet pulsing faintly with sorrow. The name inscribed across those fragments is Mary Tudor, first Queen Regnant of England, remembered by generations as Bloody Mary. But the documents whisper another story, a story not only of fire and faith, but of solitude, rejection, and the quiet ache of a woman who sought love and found only politics. To open her file is to hear the slow echo of an age trembling between old faith and new ambition, between divine order and human hunger. When Mary was born in 1516, the Tudor dynasty was still young, unsure of its footing. Her father, Henry VIII, ruled a kingdom craving legitimacy after the chaos of civil wars. Her mother, Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess of impeccable lineage, embodied the union between England and the mighty Catholic world. In the glow of her birth, courtiers celebrated the continuation of the Tudor line, though some whispered disappointment that the infant was not a boy. Still, she was a child of promise, educated in Latin, French, and theology, praised for her intellect and piety. Her childhood letters to her father were signed with reverence and hope, and Henry's early words called her "my pearl of the kingdom." The illusion of permanence dissolved when Henry's desire for a male heir collided with his conscience. As he pursued annulment from Catherine, Mary's world turned inward, darkening by degrees. One royal decree after another stripped her titles, her dignity, and finally, her identity. From Princess Mary, she became the Lady Mary, a subtle yet devastating demotion that echoed through every corridor of the court. Servants were forbidden to bow too deeply. Her mother was banished, her household dismantled. Those who visited her in exile found a young woman clinging desperately to the rituals of her childhood faith, kneeling before icons, whispering prayers in Latin, as though the sound itself might hold her together. To understand Mary's later severity, one must walk through the silence of those years. The loneliness of Hatfield, where she lived under watch, her letters intercepted, her every word monitored. The girl who had once sung before foreign ambassadors now learned to communicate in glances and half-sentences. There are descriptions of her complexion fading, her health weakening, her eyes burning with a quiet defiance. The trauma of being declared illegitimate by her own father left a wound that no crown could later mend. Those who have studied her correspondence sense a tone that is neither rebellion nor submission, but something more tragic. The voice of a daughter pleading not for power, but for recognition. The England of Mary's adolescence was a kingdom in moral confusion. The Reformation tore through Europe like a storm, and Henry VIII, in his pursuit of freedom from Rome, unwittingly unleashed forces no monarch could fully control. Old altars were smashed, monasteries dissolved, and the sacred images of Mary's childhood, candles, relics, incense, became symbols of treason. Yet she remained devout to the old ways, her loyalty not to Rome itself, but to the continuity of her mother's world. Each act of defiance against her father's reforms was, in essence, a cry to preserve the last thread of Catherine's memory. Those who saw her at court after Anne Boleyn's rise noted her composure, but also her inward retreat. Even her half-sister Elizabeth, bright and quick-tongued, could not penetrate that silence. Mary's faith was no longer a matter of ritual. It had become a fortress, one built from grief and the remnants of her childhood love. The irony is cruel. The very man who sought to control heaven's favor for a male heir had birthed, through neglect, a daughter whose spiritual conviction would later reshape England's soul in blood and prayer. By the time Henry died in 1547, Mary was 31. Her youth spent in waiting rooms of power she was forbidden to enter. Edward VI, her half-brother, ruled briefly and embraced Protestant reform with zeal. His advisers viewed Mary not merely as an inconvenience, but as a threat, the embodiment of a faith they sought to erase. Once again she was urged to abandon the old Mass, to accept the new creed. Once again she refused. The pattern of her life, obedience met by betrayal, loyalty answered with exile, deepened into conviction. Her letters to imperial ambassadors from this period reveal a woman neither naive nor hysterical, but calculating, determined, and deeply aware of her symbolic role. When Edward's health failed, and the crown was briefly offered to Lady Jane Grey, it was Mary who gathered her supporters and rode through the countryside, cheered by commoners who saw in her the legitimate heir. For the first time, she was not a pawn, but the axis of England's fate. The chroniclers describe her entry into London as both triumphant and solemn. The people shouting her name, the bells pealing through the city, the air charged with both relief and foreboding. She was 37, exhausted, and utterly alone. The coronation in 1553 was meant to mark a new dawn, yet even its pageantry carried shadows. Mary had waited her entire life for legitimacy, yet the very act of receiving the crown bound her to an expectation she could never escape: the need to produce an heir. Without one, the fragile return of Catholicism would die with her. The councillors around her, many of them seasoned survivors of previous reigns, urged her to marry quickly. Among the names proposed, one stood out: Philip of Spain, the son of Emperor Charles V, heir to one of the most formidable empires on earth. Here the record begins to thicken with political correspondence and diplomatic persuasion. To Mary, the match promised stability, an anchor against the tide of Protestant rebellion. To the council, it offered an alliance with the Habsburgs, though many feared it would place England under Spanish influence. For Philip, the marriage was an obligation, not a romance. His father's strategy required it, and so he accepted. Contemporary accounts suggest that Mary saw in Philip not only a political partner but a chance at personal redemption. After decades of abandonment, here was a man of her mother's bloodline, a fellow Catholic, a symbol of the world she had lost. She imagined a union of faith and affection, perhaps even the child she had long prayed for. Her letters from the early negotiations reveal an eagerness that bordered on longing. She ordered new gowns, commissioned jewels, and revived the ceremonies of her mother's Spain, perhaps hoping to recreate through marriage the harmony that once framed her childhood. Yet even before Philip set foot in England, signs of disquiet appeared. The English people, wary of foreign rule, muttered that their queen was selling the nation. Rebels in Kent rose in arms under Thomas Wyatt, chanting against Spanish chains. The rebellion was crushed, but its smoke lingered in the air of London when Philip arrived in July 1554. The chronicles of that summer describe the wedding in Winchester Cathedral. Candles flickering against gilded stone, incense thick enough to blur the faces of witnesses. Mary, dressed in crimson velvet embroidered with gold, knelt beside her husband-to-be. Philip, in black and white brocade, performed the ceremony with solemn courtesy. The witnesses noted his composure, her trembling. When the ring was placed upon her finger, it symbolized not only marriage, but reconciliation with the world that had once cast her out. For Mary, that moment was redemption. For Philip, it was duty. Their first weeks together were shrouded in ritual, feasts, processions, masses celebrating the union of England and Spain. The Queen's smile returned, faint but genuine. She believed she was carrying the future within her. But behind the palace doors, the distance between them widened with each passing day. Philip's retinue spoke Spanish, hers English. He preferred military councils. She sought domestic quiet. The cold London rain settled between them like a wall. From this point onward, every line of her correspondence trembles with yearning. The court physicians recorded changes in her body. Rumors of pregnancy spread. Bells rang across the city, and prayers of thanksgiving were sung. Yet as months passed, the swelling of her belly did not lead to birth. Her attendants whispered, uncertain whether it was illness, hope, or divine punishment. And when the illusion ended, Mary withdrew again into the silence that had marked her youth. The pattern of her life, expectation followed by loss, repeated with cruel precision. Her husband, unable to bear the melancholy of her court or the hostility of her subjects, departed for Spain under the pretext of duty. He promised to return soon. He did not. In that absence, the myth of Mary's cruelty began to form. The burnings of heretics, the executions, the relentless pursuit of conformity. Yet beneath the smoke of the pyres, one can sense another fire. The desperation of a woman trying to enforce unity where her own life had been torn apart. Her reign, though short, became the mirror of her inner world. Divided, wounded, seeking salvation through control. Those who found her in private during her later years wrote that her eyes seemed always fixed on some unseen horizon, as if waiting for someone who would never come. She believed herself pregnant again, and once more the physicians humored her, afraid to shatter the illusion. When the truth could no longer be hidden, she sank into despair, fasting, praying, weeping before the crucifix that hung in her chamber. The chroniclers differ on the details of her final days. Some say she died murmuring Philip's name, others that she called upon her mother. What remains certain is that she died childless, her legacy handed to her half-sister Elizabeth, whose reign would reverse nearly all she had fought for. The fires went out. The statues she restored were toppled, and history consigned her to infamy. Yet in the margins of the old chronicles, a few sympathetic hands left notes, not of politics, but of sorrow. They wrote that Mary Tudor was a woman too human for the mask she was forced to wear, too faithful for the age that betrayed her. Her pain was not born of cruelty, but of love denied, faith misunderstood, and the eternal hunger of a child, seeking her father's approval through the judgment of God. Thus the file closes with a whisper, rather than a verdict. The ink may fade, but the shadow of that longing remains. The shadow of a queen whose greatest tragedy was not that she burned her enemies, but that she could never warm the heart of those she loved most. The story of Mary's reign cannot be told without the shadow of that wedding day in Winchester Cathedral, the moment that promised salvation, yet planted the seed of despair. In the months that followed her coronation and marriage, England itself seemed to hold its breath. The bells had barely fallen silent when whispers began to circulate among merchants, nobles, and commoners alike. They said the Spaniard would rule them, that England's gold would flow to Madrid, that their queen, the daughter of a once betrayed mother, would now betray her own people. But Mary, deaf to fear and driven by purpose, pressed on. The first winter of her rule was cold and damp, yet in her chambers at Whitehall she moved with a strange, radiant conviction. She had reclaimed her crown, restored the old Mass, and married the man who, in her mind, represented the will of God. After decades of humiliation, she believed heaven itself had at last smiled upon her. To those who saw her then, she appeared transformed, her eyes brighter, her step lighter, her voice filled with new authority. She held court beside Philip, speaking to ambassadors in fluent Latin, sometimes even daring a few words of Spanish, eager to bridge the distance between them. The chroniclers observed that she clung to his arm in public, the gesture more intimate than royal decorum allowed. It was the touch of someone who, after a lifetime of absence, feared the return of solitude. Philip, meanwhile, was learning how small and suspicious this island kingdom could be. He arrived with hundreds of attendants, soldiers, priests, and bureaucrats, whose foreign manners and strict Catholic rituals unsettled Londoners. The English nobility, proud and insular, watched every move with veiled contempt. Parliament had already ensured that Philip would hold no real power in England. He could not appoint officials, nor claim the crown after Mary's death, unless she bore him a son. To him, this was not a partnership, but a gilded cage. There are accounts of the young prince walking the galleries of Whitehall with a restlessness he could not hide, speaking curtly with his counselors, lamenting the damp air and the gloom. He missed the sun of Castile, the command of armies, the weight of empire. In England, he was a consort, not a king. He had come, as he once wrote to his father, to wed a nation, not a woman. Yet the woman before him, pale, fervent, and utterly devoted, would not let him remain only a symbol. She saw in him her protector, her deliverer, perhaps even the child she could never be to her own father. Mary's letters from this time breathe with anxious tenderness. She wrote of her gratitude for his kindness, of her prayers for their child, of her hope that his heart would one day be moved toward affection. But between the lines runs a trembling insecurity, the sense that she knew he was drifting away. Philip's responses were measured, courteous, and cold. He thanked her for her prayers, promised fidelity, spoke of duty. The difference between them was not only of language, but of soul. She loved with desperation. He endured with patience. Then, in the spring of 1555, the rumor began. The Queen was with child. Physicians confirmed the swelling of her belly, the cessation of her monthly courses, the fatigue that marked early pregnancy. Bells rang, processions filled the streets, and preachers proclaimed that God had answered England's prayers. Mary ordered special masses of thanksgiving. In private, she wept with joy. She believed at last that her suffering had meaning, that God had chosen her womb to heal the breach her father had opened with Rome. But beneath the jubilation, the kingdom was uneasy. Protestants who had fled during Edward's reign began to return, hoping for tolerance. Instead, Mary, urged on by her confessor and by the examples of Spain, moved to cleanse her realm of heresy. The burnings began that year, First, a few outspoken preachers, then entire groups of dissenters. To the Queen, this was not cruelty, but purification. The same fire that refined her soul must cleanse England's. Each execution was, in her mind, a prayer made visible. The foreign ambassadors watched with a mixture of awe and horror. They wrote that she attended Mass daily, sometimes twice, and spent long hours in prayer. Yet her joy was genuine, even childlike. She told her ladies that her baby had kicked, that she felt the presence of life within. Philip humored her, though his letters to Spain reveal impatience. He had begun to suspect the truth, that it was a phantom pregnancy, a cruel trick of the body and mind. As the months passed and no child came, her faith turned inward once more. Physicians whispered theories of illness. Courtiers avoided her gaze. The joy of the court curdled into dread. When her due date arrived and passed without birth, Mary refused to believe it. She remained secluded in her chambers, waiting, praying, until even she could no longer deny the silence of her womb. The chronicles are merciless in their detail, how the banners prepared for the prince's baptism were quietly removed, how the midwives, once stationed at her bedside, slipped away in shame, how the music ceased in the palace halls. The illusion shattered, and with it the fragile thread that bound her to Philip. Within weeks, he requested leave to return to the continent, citing urgent matters of war. He kissed her hand, promised to return, and sailed from Portsmouth under a grey sky. Those who saw her watch his ship vanish wrote that she stood motionless for hours, her face a mask of stone. It was then that Mary's reign began to turn from hope to tragedy. Deprived of her husband's presence, she threw herself deeper into religion and governance. The fires of Smithfield and Oxford burned brighter. Among those condemned was the aged Archbishop Cranmer, the man who had annulled her parents' marriage decades earlier. His death, some said, gave her peace. Others saw it as vengeance disguised as justice. Yet even in those harshest months, fragments of vulnerability appear. One chronicler records that she kept a small reliquary containing a lock of Philip's hair. Another that she ordered Spanish tapestries for the palace halls, as if to fill the void he left behind. When ambassadors mentioned him, her eyes lit briefly, then dimmed. The child she had lost, or never had, became the phantom companion of her prayers. By 1556, Europe was again at war, and Philip, now King of Spain after his father's abdication, wrote to her seeking England's alliance. The letter was formal, almost perfunctory, but to Mary it was a summons of love. She pleaded with her council to support him against France, arguing that it was God's will to aid her husband. Parliament hesitated, fearing to entangle England in foreign wars. Yet Mary persisted, even as her health waned. Her attendants noted that she spoke often of divine purpose, that she believed every trial was a test sent by heaven. To those who begged her to rest, she replied, "I was not crowned for ease." Her faith had become indistinguishable from self-punishment. The burnings continued. The realm grew restless. But in her mind, every heretic's scream was a note in a hymn that would purify the land. When Philip returned briefly in 1557, the reunion was formal, almost ceremonial. He stayed for only a few weeks, long enough to secure England's declaration of war against France. Witnesses said that Mary glowed at his arrival, that she followed him with her eyes at every audience, that she addressed him as my lord and light. He treated her with courtesy, kissed her forehead, and departed again. She never saw him with joy after that day. The following year brought calamity, the loss of Calais, England's last foothold on the continent. To Mary, it was more than a military defeat. It was a divine judgment. She fell ill soon after, struck by fever and melancholy. Once again she convinced herself she was pregnant, telling her ladies that she felt life stirring within. No one dared contradict her. The courtiers arranged preparations as before, though in whispers they feared the worst. When the illusion collapsed a second time, even her closest attendants could no longer meet her eyes. Her body weakened. Her mind turned to Philip, the husband who now ruled a vast empire and wrote her only in formalities. She clung to the belief that he would return to her bedside. He did not. The letters she sent to Spain grew shorter, filled with blessings and apologies. In one, she asked that if she died, he remember her as one who loved you more than her own soul. As her strength faded, she withdrew from public life. The council began to look toward her half-sister Elizabeth, whose Protestant sympathies offered a safer future for the nobility. Mary, sensing betrayal, tried to summon resolve, but found none left. The same loneliness that had marked her youth now encircled her throne. The palace, once bright with ceremony, fell silent, except for the chanting of priests. In those final months, she ordered the restoration of Catholic rites across the realm, though many were only symbolic. She insisted on hearing Mass daily, sometimes from her bed. The courtiers who attended her described an atmosphere of perpetual twilight, candles burning at all hours, incense thick as fog, the Queen whispering prayers in Spanish. She wore black, even in daylight, her hands clasping a rosary until her knuckles bruised. The chroniclers disagree on her last words, but one account claims that, as death approached, she murmured of two losses. When I am dead and opened, they shall find Calais lying in my heart. Another, more intimate, suggests she called upon Philip, my lord, my child. Perhaps both are true, for in the end, her love for him and her duty to England were inseparable wounds. When she died in November 1558, the bells of London tolled without joy. Her coffin, draped in crimson and gold, was carried to Westminster Abbey. Few wept openly, yet even her enemies acknowledged her courage. Behind the solemnity of the rites, whispers already stirred, of Elizabeth's coronation, of the dawn of a new age. The world turned its face from Mary, leaving her to history's mercy. Yet history has never been kind. To the generations that followed, she became a symbol of fanaticism, the queen who burned her subjects alive in pursuit of faith. But the older records, the ones that still sleep in the archives, tell of a different woman, one shaped by rejection, yearning for belonging, and haunted by the echo of her father's voice. Each act of severity, each command signed in her name, was, in some measure, an answer to that voice, an attempt to restore divine order where human love had failed her. The scholars who have re-examined her reign find not a monster, but a mirror. In Mary's life are reflected the contradictions of her age, devotion and cruelty, tenderness and tyranny, faith and despair. She was a woman trapped in the machinery of monarchy, compelled to rule through the same authority that had once crushed her. And when the machinery consumed her, history mistook its smoke for her soul. Now, centuries later, the parchment still breathes faintly with her presence. Her story, when read without the distortions of legend, becomes less a chronicle of persecution and more a lamentation, the testament of a heart that mistook duty for love and love for salvation. The file closes once again, the ink settling into silence, but the shadow remains. A queen who sought to redeem the sins of her father through faith and lost herself in the process. The vault of history opens once more, and the air inside is heavy, not with the scent of incense this time, but of smoke and grief. The England Mary left behind was a country torn between two mirrors, one reflecting her faith, the other her failure. To those who gathered in the shadows of Westminster after her passing, she was already half forgotten, her name swallowed by the swift current of succession. Yet in the deeper layers of record, in the private letters, the diaries of ambassadors, and the marginal notes of frightened clerks, her presence lingered like a ghost that refused to leave the chamber. Philip received news of her death in Brussels, far from the damp streets of London that had once echoed with her devotion. His reply, preserved in diplomatic archives, was brief, courteous, regretful, impersonal. He ordered masses for her soul and sent condolences to the council. No sign of grief, no expression of love. For him, she had been a chapter of necessity, closed without sentiment. For Mary, whose heart had beat to his absence until her last breath, the silence that followed her death was the final proof that even memory could betray. Elizabeth Tudor, her half-sister and successor, stepped into power with cautious poise. The coronation of the new queen was a spectacle of relief. Banners, trumpets, the return of colour to a court long shrouded in black. The bonfires that had once consumed heretics now blazed in celebration of renewal. Yet the ashes of Mary's reign lay everywhere, in the ruined lives of priests, in the empty monasteries half rebuilt, in the quiet fear that faith itself had become a weapon. In the first proclamations of Elizabeth's rule, Mary's name was rarely spoken. When it appeared, it was softened by courtesy. Our late sister of blessed memory. But the implication was clear. Her reign was a caution, not a legacy. Within months, her religious policies were reversed. The Latin Mass silenced again. The English Bible returned to the altar. Statues she had restored were hidden once more. The realm moved swiftly to erase her touch, as though purging a fever from the body politic. And yet, beneath the clean new surface of Protestant triumph, something uneasy persisted. Chroniclers of the following decades, writing under Elizabeth's protection, still found themselves drawn back to Mary's story, compelled by a fascination they could not name. They wrote of her piety and her pride, of the burnings that had shocked the conscience of Europe, of her phantom pregnancies that blurred the line between faith and delusion. Even as they condemned her, they could not forget her. It was as if England itself carried a faint scar beneath the skin, invisible, but always felt when touched. Some of her contemporaries tried to explain her cruelty as a sickness of the mind, others as the inevitable fruit of her Catholic upbringing. But a few, very few, glimpsed a deeper cause, the ancient loneliness that had shaped her from childhood. They saw that every fire she lit in the name of faith was, in truth, a desperate plea for belonging. To burn was to purify, to cleanse not only the land, but the wound within herself. The historian reading those notes today senses that what the nation experienced as tyranny, Mary may have lived as penance. Her legacy was not entirely confined to theology. In the fragile diplomacy between England and Spain, her marriage had left a residue of mistrust. The English feared foreign influence, and Spain, in turn, viewed England as fickle and treacherous. When Philip later prepared his great armada against Elizabeth in 1588, the old chroniclers remembered Mary, not as a queen, but as the hinge upon which the door of alliance had once turned and then slammed shut. In that sense, she became a ghost that haunted both nations. To Spain, the wife who failed to produce an heir. To England, the queen who nearly surrendered her soul to a foreign throne. Yet the private Mary, the one glimpsed in letters written in trembling script, speaks differently. Those documents, fragile and browned with age, reveal a woman painfully self-aware. She understood that her subjects despised her husband, that her counsel obeyed her from fear more than loyalty, that her body had betrayed her. She confessed to her confessor that she feared damnation, not for the blood she shed, but for the pride she could not extinguish. "I burn for the truth," she once said, "but the flame consumes even me." There are entries from her ladies-in-waiting, describing the Queen walking through empty corridors long after midnight, barefoot, her rosary trailing against the floor. They found her in the chapel, kneeling before the image of the Virgin, whispering prayers in a voice too soft to hear. When they urged her to rest, she only shook her head. "Sleep belongs to those who are forgiven," she murmured. To understand the paradox of Mary's life is to stand in that dim chapel and feel the collision of devotion and despair. Her death left not only a theological vacuum, but a moral one. The generation that grew up under Elizabeth learned to remember Mary through stories, tales of martyrs, pamphlets printed in secret, sermons that painted her as the handmaiden of Antichrist. In taverns and marketplaces, the phrase Bloody Mary became shorthand for fanaticism. Mothers frightened their children with her name. Poets used it to rhyme with terror. The woman who had once sought to heal the wound between heaven and England was now the wound itself, carried forward in rumor and myth. But myths, like ashes, conceal traces of the fire that made them. In the 19th century, when the first scholars began to re-examine her reign with less venom, they found evidence that complicated the legend. The burnings, though terrible, were not uniquely hers. Such persecutions had scarred both Protestant and Catholic lands alike. Her economic policies, far from disastrous, had stabilized the coinage and strengthened trade. Her efforts to restore monastic lands had laid groundwork for later reforms in charity and education. Even her marriage treaty, once seen as submission, was legally astute. It preserved English sovereignty despite pressure from the Habsburg Empire. Yet the revision of her character could not erase the emotional truth of her tragedy. She had ruled in an age that allowed women power only through the lens of motherhood or marriage, and in both she had failed. Her reign stood as proof that a woman's worth, in the eyes of her contemporaries, was measured not by governance or courage, but by her ability to bear a son. The phantom pregnancies were thus not only personal humiliations, but national ones, symbols of a body and a kingdom that refused to yield life. Among the few who mourned her sincerely was Cardinal Pole, her cousin and spiritual advisor. He died just hours after she did, as though unwilling to survive her disgrace. His final writings speak of her as the candle that burned itself to give light to others. That line, too easily dismissed as pious exaggeration, captures a truth modern historians often miss. Mary's intensity was not the product of malice, but of exhaustion. She had been fighting since childhood, for legitimacy, for love, for divine favor, and she knew no other way to live than to fight still. Even Philip, years later, when age had softened the steel of his ambition, is said to have recalled her with a kind of melancholy respect. A courtier recorded that he once referred to her as a good wife, unfortunate in all things. It was the nearest he ever came to affection. Perhaps in his quiet, calculating mind, he recognized that her devotion to him had been purer than anything politics could forge. But by then, the world had moved on. Elizabeth's empire of words and ships, of explorers and poets, had replaced Mary's fragile dream of spiritual unity. The daughter of Catherine of Aragon became a footnote in the story of her father's line, the broken link between the Renaissance and the modern state. Still, when one stands before her tomb in Westminster, the irony is almost unbearable. She lies buried beside Elizabeth, the sister who undid everything she had built. Two queens, two faiths, two visions of England, sleeping side by side beneath the same stone. On the surface of the tomb, their names are joined as if in reconciliation, but history whispers otherwise. One ruled by fire, the other by light. One prayed for heaven's approval, the other seized the world's. Between them lies the long corridor of English conscience, stretching through centuries of remembrance and forgetting. To read her life as mere failure is to misunderstand the human depth of power itself. Mary was not a saint, nor simply a tyrant, but something far more tragic, a believer in a world losing its belief. She stood at the edge of two epochs, one ruled by divine authority, the other by human reason, and was crushed between them. The same hand that signed decrees of death also wrote tenderly to a husband who never answered. The same lips that ordered executions also kissed the crucifix each morning. She embodied the contradiction of an age that demanded faith, yet punished its expression. Her parental pain, as later writers would call it, was not limited to the children she never bore. It was the pain of every ruler who seeks to nurture a people that will not love them back, of every believer who reaches for heaven and finds only silence. The England she left behind grew into greatness under her sister, yet it carried traces of her endurance, a strange mixture of guilt and gratitude. Each time the nation spoke of conscience, of duty, of sacrifice, a shadow passed behind those words. A shadow in the shape of a solitary woman kneeling before an unseen God. And so the file ends where it began, in the twilight between faith and loneliness. The documents fade, the ink curls, but the image remains, a queen standing in the echo of her father's chapel, clutching a rosary with hands too small to hold the weight of a kingdom. History calls her bloody, but the older voices, buried deeper in the dust, call her by another name. Maria Misericordia, Mary of Mercy. Whether that mercy was ever granted, no record tells. Perhaps it was never meant to be. For some souls, the judgment is to be remembered not for what they did, but for what they desired and were denied. The corridors of Westminster grew quiet after her passing, but the echo of Mary's reign lingered in the stones. Even when the new queen, Elizabeth, filled the halls with music, laughter, and the bright silks of a new court, there remained corners where the air was still heavy with incense and sorrow. Some servants refused to enter her old chapel after dark, saying they could still hear a woman's voice murmuring prayers in Latin. The scent of wax and myrrh, they said, never truly left the air. History rarely grants ghosts such endurance, but Mary's shadow was not a thing of superstition. It lived on in conscience, in fear, in the quiet guilt that England carried like a fever. In the years that followed her death, her memory was unmade and remade according to the needs of those who survived her. Elizabeth's advisers, eager to distance the new reign from the smoke of the burnings, began the careful work of rewriting the story. The sermons declared her rule an age of tyranny. Pamphleteers whispered of her cruelty, her delusion, her barren womb. Each tale grew darker in the retelling, until the woman vanished entirely, leaving behind only the legend. The Queen of Flames, the embodiment of fanatic faith. Bloody Mary. The name was meant to purge her from memory, yet it secured her immortality. For a generation few dared to speak otherwise. England's conscience was fragile, its identity remade by rhetoric and triumph. To question the myth was to risk being seen as a traitor to the new order. But in the private writings of diplomats, scholars, and monks who fled the Reformation's second wave, fragments of the real woman survived. They described not a monster, but a melancholy soul, one who mistook divine will for human love. In their accounts, her cruelty was not pleasure, but penance, paying an act of self-purification in a world she believed damned. These were dangerous words in Elizabeth's England, where faith had become as political as birthright. And so they were hidden, written in cipher, sealed in letters that crossed the Channel at night. Spain, too, carried her name like a wound. To the Spanish court, she was the queen who had failed to give Philip an heir, the alliance that ended in ashes. Yet among some of Philip's courtiers there remained a curious reverence for her devotion. They spoke of her as una santa sin milagros, a saint without miracles. It was not pity but recognition. They saw in her the reflection of their own empire's piety, stripped of glory, left only with faith. It is said that when Philip received news of her death, he walked to the window and stood for a long while, silent. "I did not deserve her," he murmured, though no one could tell whether he spoke from sincerity or habit. Whatever affection he had once felt, it was buried beneath the weight of empire. Within a year, he would marry again, first to the young Elizabeth of Valois, then to others, each union a link in the chain of dynastic necessity. For Philip, love was a treaty. For Mary, it had been salvation. As the decades passed, her image hardened into parable. Playwrights and preachers alike found use for her name. The English stage, always hungry for villains cloaked in robes of faith, turned her likeness into archetype. The zealot queen, the woman undone by passion and belief. The crowds who cheered Elizabeth's victories over Spain shouted her sister's name as a curse. And yet, the more she was condemned, the more irresistible her story became. Her tragedy contained all the contradictions that fascinated an age, torn between superstition and reason, body and soul, woman and monarch. There are later records from the monasteries that survived in secret, hidden brotherhoods who continued the old mass under threat of death. In their missals, written by candlelight, they prayed for Maria Regina, martyr of faith. They believed she had died not in sin, but in sacrifice, consumed by the same fire she had ordered lit. Their theology was simple. She had been too human for her time, too earnest in an age of hypocrisy. The flames that devoured her victims had already burned within her heart long before the first match was struck. Even her body was denied peace. Decades after her burial, when Westminster was repaired and reordered, her coffin was opened, to make room beside it for Elizabeth's. Those who witnessed the exhumation wrote that her remains were small, almost weightless. The workmen, uncertain which queen should lie above the other, placed Elizabeth's coffin atop Mary's. The inscription they carved upon the shared tomb read, "Consorts in faith and hope, sisters in peace." But the irony is too sharp to fade. In death, they were forced into harmony that life never allowed. Beneath Elizabeth's grandeur, Mary's dust remained unseen, her story buried once again beneath another's glory. Centuries later, scholars would open the records anew, brushing dust from parchment and expectation alike. They found inconsistencies, contradictions, and forgotten tenderness. The image of the cruel queen began to waver. Letters written in her own hand revealed a voice trembling between command and confession. In one, she asked a trusted confessor whether it was a sin to love a husband who did not return her affection. In another, she begged forgiveness for the blood shed in zeal, not in anger. Her handwriting, sharp, deliberate, suggests neither hysteria nor madness, but reason strained to breaking point. Her reign, when viewed without the distortion of later propaganda, appears less as a carnival of cruelty than as a desperate experiment in restoration. The England she inherited was fractured, Protestant nobles at odds with Catholic gentry, an economy weakened by inflation, a countryside restless after years of reform. She attempted to heal the division through the only language she knew, obedience to faith. In doing so, she confused unity with submission. What she sought to mend, she ultimately tore wider apart. Yet for all her failures, she achieved one quiet victory that history seldom records. Under her rule, the coinage was reformed and stabilized, halting the economic decay begun by her father's greed. She invested in naval repairs, laying foundations that would later serve Elizabeth's expansion. Even the burnings, ghastly as they were, did not bankrupt the realm as some feared. Her administration remained disciplined, her finances cautious. She governed not as a tyrant of impulse, but as a bureaucrat of conviction. And therein lay the tragedy. She believed systems could save souls. The chroniclers of her own time, unable to reconcile such contradictions, chose simplicity. To them, she was either holy or damned. But the modern eye sees something subtler. A woman whose mind bore the logic of theology, but whose heart bore the confusion of love. Her parental pain extended beyond her childless womb. It was the ache of inheritance itself. She had inherited her father's ambition without his charm, her mother's faith without her grace, and the crown of England without the affection of its people. In the dim corners of the archive, one can almost trace the evolution of her reputation. The first denunciations written in fiery Protestant rhetoric, the cautious Catholic defenses penned in exile, the Victorian reinterpretations that cast her as tragic heroine, and finally, the cold academic analyses of the modern age. Each generation remakes her in its own image, the zealot, the martyr, the mother, the monster. Yet through them all runs one immutable truth. Mary Tudor was a woman who believed love and salvation were the same thing, and she lived in an age that proved her wrong. If one stands today in the old chapel at St. James's Palace, where she once heard Mass before dawn, the air still seems charged. The altar stone, worn smooth, bears the faint imprint of centuries of hands, perhaps hers among them. The sunlight that filters through the leaded windows falls in bands of red and gold, the colors of her heraldry. Outside, tourists chatter, their footsteps echoing across the cobblestones. Inside, the silence endures. History has a way of keeping its most wounded souls in quiet places. It is tempting to imagine that somewhere in that silence, Mary finally found peace. Not the peace of vindication, but of understanding. For if her life proved anything, it is that truth and mercy rarely coexist in the realm of power. She sought one through the other, and found neither. Yet the persistence of her story, told and retold through centuries, is itself a kind of redemption. The woman who could not bear a child gave birth instead to legend, one that continues to haunt the conscience of those who study her. As the chroniclers close their books and the archivists lock the cabinets, her voice still whispers between the lines. Not in Latin now, but in the universal language of longing. Remember me, she seems to say, not for the fires I lit, but for the ones I carried within. And perhaps that is enough. The file returns to its shelf, its wax seal cracked, its ink trembling in the light. Time, which devours all empires, has not devoured her completely. Her name remains on the tongue of history, not pure, not damned, but human. And in that frail humanity lies the final truth of Mary Tudor, that power, faith, and love, when bound together, can make a woman immortal, not in glory but in sorrow. The centuries turned, and the ink of Mary's name deepened rather than faded. It clung to the conscience of England like an old bruise, one pressed again each time the nation spoke of faith, rebellion, or queenship. In every age that followed, when England faced its crises of belief, her story was summoned from the archives to warn, to accuse, or to pity. Yet somewhere, beyond the sermons and the scholarship, beyond even the myths that made her monstrous, there lingers a quieter truth. That Mary Tudor never truly died in disgrace, but continued to live as a question the English soul could never answer. What becomes of love when it is bound to power? In the 17th century, when the civil wars tore the realm apart and the heads of kings fell beneath the blade, pamphleteers invoked her name once more. The Puritans spoke of her as the proof of papal tyranny, while royalists, seeing their own faith persecuted, began to whisper that perhaps she had not been so cruel after all. Her image flickered, shifting with each new upheaval. First a demon, then a warning, then almost, though never quite, a martyr. In this strange half-light, she became a mirror in which England saw not her face, but its own. By the 18th century, when the Enlightenment spread across Europe and reason replaced revelation, her story was recast again. Historians in powdered wigs and candlelit studies looked upon her not as a queen of fire, but as a psychological curiosity. They called her melancholic, hysterical, a victim of superstition and misplaced love. They dissected her like a relic under glass, counting her mistakes, cataloguing her fears. The age of philosophy could not forgive her faith, yet it pitied her earnestness. In their eyes, she was less a monster than a tragedy of misplaced conviction. Still, even among those skeptical minds, a few were unsettled. They read her letters and found themselves moved by the very sincerity that others mocked. "This woman," wrote one scholar in 1798, "believed so wholly in her God that she became both priest and sacrifice." To the rational world, such faith seemed madness, yet to the poet's heart, it carried a kind of terrible beauty. It was around this time that the painters began to reclaim her image, no longer the cruel queen of Protestant propaganda, but a sorrowful figure, cloaked in crimson and candlelight, a woman whose eyes were turned not toward her victims, but toward heaven, as though asking why devotion must always demand blood. Then came the 19th century, an age drunk on history, romanticism, and empire. Britain now ruled the seas, confident in its Protestant destiny, yet fascinated by the ghosts it had tried to bury. The Victorians, obsessed with morality and spectacle, reopened the old Tudor vaults and found Mary waiting. In their novels and stage plays, she reappeared as both villainess and victim, sometimes in the same breath. To them, she was not a warning but a fascination. The queen who loved too deeply, prayed too fiercely, and ruled with the desperate tenderness of a woman who mistook cruelty for duty. It was during this period that the phrase, "the mother of a faithless nation," began to appear in essays and poems. The image was irresistible. A barren queen mourning not a lost child, but a lost people. Writers imagined her wandering the halls of Whitehall as a ghostly mother, calling out to subjects who would never answer. This was the beginning of her slow redemption, not through forgiveness, but through sympathy. The age that idolized the Virgin Mother could not help but weep for a woman who longed for motherhood and found only solitude. The 20th century, with its wars and revelations, cast yet another light upon her. The rise of psychology, feminism, and the study of trauma turned scholars away from theology and toward the human heart. The woman once called Bloody Mary was reinterpreted as a casualty of patriarchy, her cruelty reframed as the inevitable outcome of a lifetime spent under the tyranny of fathers, husbands, and councils. The historians who had once laughed at her delusion now saw in it a mirror of their own century's despair, the endless search for meaning in a world stripped of faith. She was no longer a sinner nor a saint, but something rarer, a human being caught in the machinery of belief. The scholars who visited Westminster to see her tomb described an odd feeling, a weight, as if the air itself remembered grief. The slab above her, shared with Elizabeth, bears an inscription that claims unity. But those who linger know better. Beneath that stone lie two visions of England, locked forever in uneasy silence. One born of devotion, the other of doubt. Tourists take their photographs and move on, unaware that beneath their feet rests a question that no age has yet answered. The modern mind, eager for rational order, still recoils from the depth of her longing. Yet the more one reads her story, the harder it becomes to dismiss. The letters to Philip, though often cited as evidence of her naivety, reveal a courage too private to be political. "I have loved," she wrote once, "as my mother loved my father, and that is my only fault." In another, written in the final months of her life, she confided to her confessor that she feared dying without forgiveness, not from God, but from her people. "They will hate me," she wrote, "because I loved them as one loves a wayward child, with punishment and tears." And perhaps she was right. The people she tried to redeem remembered only the punishment. They forgot the tears. As the archives yielded more of her correspondence, historians began to piece together a portrait that no legend could contain. The so-called Burning Queen spent her final years supporting hospitals for the poor, funding education for orphaned girls, and repairing the sacred sites her father had dismantled. She welcomed the sick into the palace gardens, walking slowly among them and placing coins in their hands. These small, unheralded gestures, overlooked by the grand records of her reign, reveal the paradox at the heart of her character. A ruler whose public actions inspired fear, yet whose private moments murmured of compassion. If the modern age has done her any measure of justice, it lies in rediscovering that paradox. Contemporary historians no longer portray her as a warning, but as a figure essential to understanding her time. They suggest that Mary's tragedy was rooted not in her belief, but in the age she inhabited, an era already fading, one that still trusted redemption could be reached through ritual and devotion. As that world crumbled around her, she stood amid its ruins, trying to rebuild it with faith worn thin. Her downfall was not one of morality, but of history itself. She clung to a vision the world no longer wished to see. She tried to save a dying age by becoming its last disciple. Yet time, that most ruthless judge, has softened toward her. The language of modern remembrance, the documentaries, the museum plaques, the essays that fill the shelves of academic libraries, no longer spit her name in anger. They speak of her as a paradox, a figure of compassion entwined with cruelty, faith with fear. And through that lens, her story becomes something larger than the Reformation, larger even than the Tudor line. It becomes the eternal story of every soul who reaches for light and finds the cost unbearable. Standing in the hushed nave of Westminster, one might imagine the centuries folding like pages, and from the silence between them, a voice emerging, low, weary, and unmistakably human. If Mary could speak to us now, perhaps she would not ask for absolution. She might only ask to be seen as she was, a woman of fierce belief, born into a kingdom of doubt. Her sins, if they were sins, were the sins of certainty. Her punishments, the same as her rewards: solitude, misinterpretation, and immortality. The paradox of Mary Tudor is that she sought eternity and achieved it, though not as she hoped. Her fires have long gone out, but her story still burns, a slow ember in the consciousness of those who study her. Every historian who opens her letters, every pilgrim who stands before her tomb, becomes part of the same ritual she began, the endless attempt to reconcile devotion with humanity. It is perhaps the closest she will ever come to absolution. In the end, her legacy rests not in doctrine or politics, but in emotion. She forces us to confront the discomfort of empathy, to feel sorrow for the condemned, to mourn the one who condemned them. That is her final triumph. She makes it impossible to judge without reflection, to speak her name without tasting both ash and grace. And so the file closes once more, but this time with a softer sound, not the sharp snap of judgment, but the slow whisper of understanding. The candle gutters in the archive's darkness, casting long shadows across the parchment. Outside, the world has moved on. Faith has waned, empires have crumbled, and the name of Mary Tudor rests quietly among the forgotten. Yet for those who listen, she still breathes in the folds of history, not as a warning, but as a reminder that power, when fused with longing, becomes both creation and curse. Somewhere beyond the noise of centuries, in that narrow space between memory and myth, she walks again through the corridors of Whitehall. No longer queen, no longer penitent, only human. The weight of the crown is gone, the fires are out, and the silence she carries now is her own. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.